back. WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. This here will be a Baltimore Positive kind of piece. I know we had tried to get our guest out a couple of times back when we were actually able to hug and hang out at State Fair, and Moeller could drink, 2 pounds of coffee, and I could get chicken and waffles and all that stuff. State Fair is still there. They're curbside, and they are more than that, opening up now 6 feet away. They have a beautiful tent over there. I know Don was checking out the new Mexican restaurant Evan Brown's going to open across the street, so we will all be getting back to Catonsville soon. Also, a shout-out to our friends at Fadley Seafood in downtown Lexington Market. Crab cakes, you can stop by. You can still curbside there, but you can ship the world-famous crab cakes anywhere in the world. It's a click away. I can't think of anyone who won't appreciate you shipping them some Fadleys come summertime here. We'll get them to the other side. They're also coming to Catonsville as well. Last plug for Taharka and Taharka Ice Cream, one of our great sponsors here, made in Baltimore. I ate all the chocolate love. I didn't leave any for Moeller, but he's got 8 pints of it. How much of that do you have left? Have you eaten? Have you worked your way through all the honey graham yet?
We're trying not to gain the COVID-15, so we've cut back. We've still got like 5 of the pints left, and we're going to go back to it here in a couple of days when we get the weight back where it should be.
Well, 5 pints means you're doing a pint a day, from what I'm doing the math on that. Also, our friends at Moeller and Gary Realty, and of course, Don's son Jeff, closing deals. You need to list, you need to buy, you need to sell, and I got to get Jeff back on next week because it's been a couple months since I've had him on at WNST. We'll do that. You can find them at Moeller and Gary Realty as well. Don, I'm going to let you do the introductions here because we have someone that's been a public servant and a servant of people in many, many ways, and we've been trying to get Ben Jealous on here for a couple of months. Then everything got shut down, and here we are. So finally good to have Ben Jealous with us.
Oh, it's great to have my friend Ben Jealous join us as we try to take really a deep dive into race in America, where we are, where we've been, where we're heading, talking about elections, and no one really better suited to bring that perspective. A former gubernatorial candidate, former national president of the NAACP, lifelong civil rights activist, and a lot of new things in his life. So, Ben, welcome to Baltimore Positive.
Well, thank you, Don. It's good to be here, man. I really wish we could be doing this in person.
Yeah, just for the food alone. I mean, the company. Yeah.
Right.
Well, yeah, Ben and I had broken bread at State Fair, have we not?
Yeah, it was a good place.
We will do it again.
Yeah. Well, Go ahead, Don. Yeah, it's all yours.
Go ahead, jump in.
Well, first things first. I mean, you ran for elected at the top, and there was that night where you're waiting to see if you win. We're in this never world here of a couple of days after an election, and Don and I put Baltimore Positive together, full disclosure, a year and a half ago, with the eye on the city and who the next mayor would be, and and this is before Catherine was raided by the FBI. I mean, we're talking a year and a half ago, and we're at this election, and I mean, what happened in the first is crazy, and the fact that I'm looking online and I can't even see if they've gotten my ballot yet, and I mailed it a week ago.
Yeah, no, it's crazy, and it's the reality is that when it comes to our state, the function of government has been neglected ever since Martin left. Whatever you think of Larry Hogan, when you dive into the way that he actually runs these departments and his folks run these departments, there's a lot to be lacking. We've seen it with the unemployment checks. We've seen it with the, with the administration of this election. And it's really deeply frustrating.
Well, Ben, it's so interesting, and you articulated that on the campaign trail. And as I said, we have so much to talk about today. But Nestor and I, early on in the pandemic, were very complimentary of the governor as he appeared. He was on top of things. He was communicating with the people of Maryland, and the contrast between what was happening with that.
Well, also the plane coming in from South Korea was a big. I mean, that was one of of his whole tenure, other than his cancer battle. That was a day when we're bringing 500,000 testing kits in. My wife and I haven't been tested yet, but yes.
So we were certainly complimentary of that. But then recently, what we see are, and it's frustrating, and you certainly talked about this when you ran. I think that we had Stuart Pittman on recently. I've been in recent communication with Baltimore County Executive Johnny O. They are extremely frustrated because in the most recent 3 or 4 pronouncements that have come out of Annapolis, the local county executives and the mayors are finding out what the state's doing next when the governor announces it to the press. So they're then left scrambling, trying to be, and that's just silly partisan gamesmanship that people don't have time for, Ben.
100%, and can't afford. And we're tolerant of when the stakes were lower. Stakes were still high, before COVID, but they were lower. But literally now these are life and death things. We've seen a lot of people die. Folks, we had a 15-year-old in the public housing projects in Baltimore die, about a week and a half ago. And so efficiency might sound cold, but efficiency means that you help as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. And so when you're not operating the government in a way that's efficient in the midst of a pandemic, it means people die unnecessarily.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking on so many levels. And when you bring your insight, and people heard it when you ran for governor, but I'd like you to reiterate it with a focus on your background on several particular pieces. You're growing up, and your mom back at that time is fighting to desegregate Western High School. You end up then I'd like you to talk about that. And then I'd like you to talk about being at Columbia University and ending up in Mississippi as a young black guy trying to fight for justice in Mississippi, and how all of that comes together to shape who Ben Jealous is.
Well, and it really came together in running for governor, I got to tell you, because when I was running for governor here, my dear friend Stacey Abrams, and when I say dear friend, I mean we've been organizing and working together since we were 20 years old. It's not just like the political kind of shorthand for somebody I met yesterday, but my dear friend Stacey Abrams was running for governor of Georgia, and we met in Mississippi.
Talk about crooked elections. I just got to throw that in, but go ahead.
Yeah, oh my gosh, Kemp is the worst. And we met in Mississippi when we were 20 years old, because the Republican governor of Mississippi, a man named Kirk Fordyce, had said that he was going to shut down a public historically black college, think Morgan State, and replace it with a prison. And so it was just outrageous. And we and a guy named Derek Johnson, who's a good friend who now is the national president of the NAACP, and we were all in our early 20s. Stacey and I were 20. Derek was 22. And we organized a campaign that stopped the governor from turning a college into a prison. For Stacey and I, we had both grown up in the civil rights movement. Her parents had met as high school activists in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Her father was the enforcer of a very famous boycott there. My parents had met in Baltimore as school teachers at Harlem Park Junior High, both active in the civil rights movement. Dad, who's white and from Maine, was active in the Congress of Racial Equality. Mom, who's black and from West Baltimore, had grown up in the NAACP under Juanita Mitchell, and had been very active with SNCC. And they were, in protests in downtown Baltimore with CORE to accelerate the desegregation of the city. And Dad ended up going to jail. For Mom, her activism in the city, as you mentioned, had begun when she was 12 years old. She sued Western High School with an eye towards attending it when she was 15. When she sued it was 1952. When she desegregated one of the first 10 black girls, all as a group, they went through. They were the first ones to go through Western on the way. It was 1955, and my mom, to say kind of the woman who raised me, I was thinking about this yesterday because we were on with MSEA talking to all the teachers just about race in this moment, and I pulled my mom on because who better? But that summer, 1956, right? So in the fall of '55, next summer's '56. Mom goes down to Petersburg to help desegregate churches in sit-ins. The sit-in movement we talked about starting in like 60, 61, but she was already engaged in sit-ins in 56. Having spent the school year getting heckled and harassed desegregating Western, she decided to spend her summer vacation going further south to do something arguably more controversial and desegregate churches. And it's when you're raised by folks like that, you understand that in moments like this, the most important thing you can do is to help evolve our democracy. And for young people, that's usually being in the streets, and for us older folks, that's sitting down and figuring out, how do we improve the law? How do we build a more perfect union? How do we change practices? How do we change who we recruit? How do we handle discipline of police officers differently? Police officers deserve to be supported. I've got, my family's been in law enforcement in Maryland now, I think, for 3 generations. My grandfather was the first. My cousins today picked up a gun and a badge and went to work in federal law enforcement. And we know it's a tough job. It's an important job. It's one of the most important jobs. And yet it is absolutely fair that it come with the highest expectations for your behavior and your discipline. And so I'm very proud of the young people who are in the streets, who are themselves disciplined. Obviously, during the Freddie Gray crisis, we learned a lot, and I think it's one of the reasons why Baltimore fared better than other cities this time. One of the most important things that we did in that crisis, certainly that I was involved in, was Pastor Jamal Bryant, who was then leading Empowerment Temple. I called him. I landed at the airport. I was getting back from a trip. City, there were fires, and it was on CNN. And I saw it as I was coming into BWI, and I called Jamal, and I said, how can I help? And he said, Ben, we were trained by the Free South Africa movement. Our parents and our grandparents were trained by the Civil Rights movement. Nobody's trained these babies in nonviolent civil disobedience, and I need you at the church tomorrow. And so he and I organized 300, mostly young people, also some adults, but everybody had been out in the streets the night before. And we put them through an intensive nonviolent civil disobedience training, all the things you do to really shape the mindset of a protester so they can't be provoked.
Can you run me through in 30 seconds or 60 seconds what that entails and where that is? I live in downtown Baltimore, Ben, and Ben Jealous is here, of course, joining us. And I told Don on a Tuesday night earlier this week, I had the windows open, and I live high up enough that I can see down onto the streets, and I heard some noise, and, there have been much bigger protests over the weekend. This was sort of a quiet day, there weren't a whole lot of things going on. I had been over at City Hall earlier, and there wasn't much going on, and I heard noise, and I heard noise. I looked out the window, and I saw folks, and I looked down. I got my binoculars, which I don't do much, and I looked down right in front of Governor Schaefer's statue, literally. Where what used to be Hooters and Phillips is now a chain restaurant. And I looked down, I saw them starting to come, and they had signs, and I looked down at my binoculars, and there were 6-year-old little girls with their parents and aunts and uncles and kids on bikes and white people and black people. It was clearly a neighborhood. It was about 300 people. And I looked out my window, and I don't think, and certainly from your background, I just didn't. After Freddie Gray, you don't want to see that again. After 68, anybody much older than me wouldn't want to see it. But here's where we are. I looked down there and I watched these people look, and I thought they walked in from a neighborhood, a church group, ministry. I don't know where they came from. They were 300. They were peaceful. They were walking through, and as I looked down, all I saw was a community of people that on a beautiful summer night came down to do things that you've been doing your whole life, your family. You talk about your background. It moved me in a way. I mean, this is 48 hours ago. To say to my wife, if we could have gone down, I want to go down. Next time I see that, I want to get on the front end, put my shoes on, put a mask on, and go down. And my wife's a 2-time survivor, so we're trying to stay away from people, with mask on, and certainly me as well. But we saw this on Tuesday, and I'm choked up talking about it. 3 times I've talked about it in the last 2 days. Just where are we when we're shooting at our citizens and bringing in Texas militia from prisons in Washington, D.C.? I know 1 million people are going to gather this weekend. You're more familiar with this, and I think it's one of the reasons Don reached out to you is to say you've seen this, you've been a part of this, you've organized, it's been a part of your life. this isn't where you want us this week. You want this to be, you don't want us to be marching like this all. I mean, we thought this was over in 68, but it's more fiery and inflamed than it's ever been. And for this generation, for younger people, for me, I'm 52 years old. I've never seen anything like this. I'm not frightened. I'm more emboldened to call a racist, which I could do in my own time, in my own way, or throw them off my page in the modern era or whatever. But confronting this is all of our responsibilities at this point. And I'm a guy that proudly took a knee 2.5 years ago in London and took on all sorts of heat. I'm from Dundalk, right? So, I mean, I grew up in Archie Bunker's America in the 70s. So, I mean, I have gladly lost relationships because I've just decided that if you're not inspired by this or moved by this and you're on the side of gassing American citizens to hold up a Bible upside down and backward, I'm glad I started Baltimore Positive, but seeing these things happen, this is not what we expected Baltimore Positive to be 18 months ago, Ben.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I'll tell you one thing also, that's interesting about it. And first of all, thank you for that, Esther. And it really speaks, I think, to just to your humanity, right? I mean, if you go back, the other day I was reading that great Baltimorean Frederick Douglass's 1852 speech to the President of the United States on the 4th of July about what does the 4th of July mean to a slave. And it is so powerful. I mean, first of all, he's 37 years old. He'd been born into slavery. He ran away. He had only run away from slavery maybe a dozen years, but before that, had to go to Ireland to earn the purse for his freedom and then purchase it in England and then return to the United States and then goes both south of the Mason-Dixon back home, even further south to D.C. And there he is speaking to a room of folks who support slavery in 1852 and just in the most brutally honest terms about, how a human being who's been enslaved by another human being views that person. And it's just a reminder of the utter humanity of all of us and the utter inhumanity of the system that we've inherited and been raised in, and the responsibility of all of us who are made in God's image to actually live up to God's expectations, to actually live up to our own deeply felt beliefs in equality and justice and fairness. The way my granddad was one of the black pioneers in law enforcement in Baltimore, a peer of Bob Watson and others. And he was afraid of law enforcement. Like, how crazy is that, right? To be afraid that your peers might mistake you for a threat. Whenever we came into Anne Arundel County, he always drove 5 miles under the speed limit. And now I got to explain to my 7-year-old son, like, why he might not, why he needs to be careful with a police officer, why he can't completely trust that they will treat him the way that they should. And it's breaking his heart, just like it broke my heart to watch my grandfather, who was my hero, have to explain to me why he was afraid of police officers when he was a probation officer. It was, and it's just time for us to evolve. And this is one of the things that I want us to understand. We are dealing with racism, yes, but we also, all have had the experience of, talking to white friends, to turning on the television, seeing a white woman killed by the police, to watching a white woman thrown down by an NYPD officer in the street the other day. And so we know that we're dealing with something that goes beyond racism. And so what is that? What is that other component? Well, that other component is, and if you guys hear a little noise in the background, this COVID life, like it's Swiss Family Robinson, but the shipwreck is our house. And my son has come in to listen to the radio. Probably with his dad. But
tell him we said hi.
Yeah. Jack, Don Muller, and Nestor Stay. And so the other thing we're dealing with is authoritarianism. There have been studies done on police officers where there are live officers working with criminologists who test them First, for their level of bias, their level of racism, to put it plainly. And second, for their level of what the researchers call aggressive masculinity, but because, it can cross genders, really what they're describing is authoritarianism. And I'll never forget watching a recording of a two police officers from Southern California. One was old, and he experienced and he tested very high on racism and very low on authoritarianism. So if you will, he was racist, but he was chill. The other one the young guy tested very low on racism. You may have had a black or brown girlfriend. Very high on authoritarianism. You were going to do what he told you to do, or there would be consequences. And each one was confronted by a black actor pretending to be a kind of deranged homeless man wielding a big stick. The Archie Bunker type, if you will, talked to him for 3 minutes and convinced him to put down the stick. The young guy shot him in 15 seconds.
Wow.
And then you look at the research on what are the last words uttered by somebody before they're shot and killed by the police. The most common last word before a police officer shoots you is the epithet for being a gay man that begins with an F. You insult a police officer's masculinity, and that's apparently the most provocative thing you can do to get them to shoot you.
I read that in David Simon's work 5 years ago after Freddie Gray, when he was trying to assess what had happened on the streets here from his time in crime, that there were things you could say to a cop in the 70s and 80s and walk away, and there were things that cops would take a special umbrage to. Rough rides and whatnot, right?
Yeah.
Well, the other interesting point to that, Nestor, and Ben, boy, do I think about it when you just described what you did. I had a former Baltimore County police chief speak to me one day. We were talking. We were trying to have a discussion about what kind of training should be involved for police officers ongoing to try to give them the skills that they need, because as you said, so many of us, you do, I do, have loved ones in law enforcement, and the overwhelming number of police officers on the streets of America are trying to do the right thing, and you have this small band of rogue officers who just continue to do the most horrific things. And he says something to me that I've never forgotten, and you just alluded to it in that study. He said, Don, the key to everything, and it's very difficult to do when you're hiring, is to find police officers who are motivated by a sense of service and not by a sense of adventure. He said, and that resonated. I thought, wow. He said, if you can weed out those who have a sense of adventure and just hire those who have a sense of service, you have a leg up. But Nestor started, Ben. He started to ask a question, and we got sidetracked. I'd like to go back to it. You said you did a workshop for folks on the keys to nonviolent protest. What are some of the things that you share with young activists who are going to take to the streets to make their point, but at the same time stay safe?
Jack, I'm on the radio. Go watch some TV, baby.
That's all right.
I'll come out when I'm done.
It's all real on Baltimore Positive when you're doing it in a pandemic.
So John, you asked me what some of the things that you did. Well, you go through some basic teachings of Gandhi. For us in the U.S., really nonviolent civil disobedience broadly practiced began with Diane Nash and Bayard Rustin having been trained by Gandhi, coming back and training activists here, and just some of the principles of nonviolence, which quite frankly also come out of the Bible, like turn the other cheek. People really understanding that this is strategic, that if you allow yourself to be tempted into violence, you will diminish your message, and the message will become your response. not any provocation from the police officer, simply that you attacked a police officer. That'll be the story. Whatever happens to you will be justified, and your movement will suffer. And then you spend a lot of time role playing and practicing not being provoked. People got to get used to their adrenaline going up, and then actually forcing their adrenaline to go back down without lashing out. And so there's a lot of, basically, if you can imagine like a line dancing line, with people on two rows on either side, but rather than celebrating, your latest dance move, they're pushing you back and forth, they're shouting at you, and your job is just to stay calm and to walk through. And then you identify folks who are natural leaders in the group, and you, Jack, you can watch TV, please go. And sorry, guys,
it's all right.
Trip, and who are real leaders in the group, and you get them to be marshals. And the marshals play a very important role in the street because they are the ones who really have the presence to help lead the crowd and diffuse it. And at the end of the day, where we do have organized groups of anarchists, I've dealt with them my entire life since I was leading street protests against police brutality after Rodney King when I was a college student in New York. You've got to have marshals to deal with the provocateurs who are in the crowds.
Well, I mean, there's so much to unpack, and you're talking to your son. I said we've all gotten used the last 3 months to all the cable.
Remember the thing in Europe a couple years ago in England when the kid came in and it was like embarrassing?
I got dogs coming in, cats, and
you should see my hair, Ben. I haven't had a haircut in 4 months. I mean,
all kinds of things. But you're talking to your son, and one of the things that Nestor and I are really trying to understand in talking with so many of our guests this week is being the parent to an African-American child in 2020. You talked about having the quote-unquote talk that we always hear about. What are your hopes and fears and dreams and as you look to your child and you think of the America that you want him to have, Ben?
My faith is that it's always darkest before it's dawn. That if you got up on the balcony of history and you could look out, say, 100 years in either direction, where we're at right now would make sense. Because, in 1980, white men were still able to decide who became president of the United States. You looked at voting patterns. Whoever white men voted, whoever won the majority of white men would be president. By 1992, you had to win white women too. By today, you've got to win, more than just that in most states, and we're rapidly getting to the place where you're going to have to win more than just that to be president of the country. And by the middle of this century, our country will be a nation only of minorities, where every group will have to get along with at least one other group demographically in order to succeed democratically. And for a lot of us, that's already happened in our families, right? My family, your family. I tell folks, look, I'm a black guy who comes from a long line of white guys, right? Like my dad's white and everybody before him. And now my brother-in-law is Jewish, and, it's like, we're all kind of increasingly mixed up, and our country's becoming like that too. And so for a lot of us, it's like, great, finally. For other folks, it's scary. They've been convinced, and you can go back to Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail and kind of observe the dynamic then that it's better, and, you meet some, folks in different parts of our region. Dundalk's one of them, where you can meet guys who really feel like they've been convinced that like being white is like worth something, and put you above somebody, and they don't realize that politically what's happened is that they've been split from everybody who doesn't look like them but shares the same frustration, shares the same aspirations, shares the same dreams, and shares the same need for change. And so, I think fundamentally, we are racing towards a day where the American people will be forced to recognize that what matters less is what you look like, and what matters more is your character and your situation and your dreams, and that you and your children will be better off if you can look past somebody's skin color and really recognize when somebody else has the same interests you do, and then organize together based on that. Because it's like all of our communities, whether you're from West Baltimore or you're from Dundalk, Bethlehem Steel left all of us. Deindustrialization hurt all of us. Men are downwardly mobile in all of our communities. And when you're talking about kind of the working class of the Baltimore City, Baltimore County region, mass incarceration is a problem, and not just for black people. I mean, 20 years ago, a white man in America was half as likely as a white man in South Africa at the height of apartheid when South Africa was the world's leading incarcerator to be incarcerated. As of 10 years ago, the last census, they were 75% as likely. There was a 50% increase in the rate of incarceration of white men in America between 2000 and 2010. I expect what we'll find from this census has gone up even higher still, because in the meantime, what you've seen amongst working class white men, and I can remember when my neighbor up the street, school years in California, summers in West Baltimore. So in California, the tire plant had shut down, and he lost his job as a foreman, and he blew his head off in the basement with a shotgun. And my two good buddies lost their father, and they would become very reckless as a result. And then one of them died in a ATV accident. He spent his father's life insurance money on buying toys, and one of them killed him. And so you look now, and the suicide rate amongst white men is through the roof. The white men in Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and our country as a whole die from gun violence, white men over 55, at a higher rate than black men and boys die from homicide. Think about that. That white men are killing over 55 are killing themselves off faster than black men and boys are killing each other in the streets.
I've never heard that one, and I am a 52-year-old Latin. Most people would look at me and say he's white. He's from East Baltimore. My father came from Venezuela and immigrated here. But I would say, and Don, maybe you would speak to that as well. How many suicides do you know of white men in your life this century? I know of plenty, but more often than I should. And we view those differently, though, don't we?
Yeah,
we do.
Far too many, including my father, who was a very successful doctor and actually president of the West Coast chapter of the AMA. So yeah, it truly is epidemic proportions.
And we've got to talk about it, because obviously suicide is simply the worst thing you can do. And there's a lot of other bad behaviors, that people are engaged in: alcoholism, meth, opiates. Just shy of suicide. And it goes back to the fact that people are hurting. They feel downwardly mobile. They're losing hope. It's simply, some people interpret it as, I don't have the privileges that I used to have of being a white man in this society. But if you look more broadly, men in America have been downwardly mobile for a long time. And we've got to be willing to talk about that and that pain, so we can find common cause, so we can create a better life for our sons. I mean, I'm very concerned about my son dealing with the police as a young black man. I'm also very concerned about just the general trends of men in our society and what my son is walking into. And it's, for me, this started when I was in grad school. And kind of close this little rant on this. When I was in grad school, there was a headline in International Herald Tribune. I was a Rhodes Scholar over in England, and I'm under the gun to figure out my master's.
This is in the early 90s, that sort of range?
Late 90s.
Okay.
Late 90s, right? So 97. It took me 7 years to get through college because I got kicked out for protest. And so
it took me 7 years of going through college because I had girls in rock and roll, but that's another story altogether.
Yeah, well, next best thing to being a rock star is being a protester when you're 20 years old. Same thing.
I would think you meet some people.
And my godbrother was Dave Chappelle, so I got to live both lifestyles
There
in New
you
York
go.
City. It was also a reason to be.
Are you in the block party video? I'm just asking. No.
No, here's the thing. I have missed all of Dave's big gatherings. We think that his father, my godfather, put a curse on me because I missed his last big party that he had organized. Dave's father used to hold these huge African American cultural celebrations, and I was supposed to be the keynote speaker, and I missed it for a protest in Mississippi, and he was really angry at me. And right up to the Mark Twain Prize, I had tickets. I was supposed to be in the second row of the Mark Twain Prize celebrating Dave, and then something came up, and I couldn't be there. So no, I was not a block party. I was not the Mark Twain Prize, but I've spent probably 500 nights in the clubs with him in my life, and so anyways, I'm walking down the street in Oxford, England, and there's a headline in the International Herald Tribune, and it says, U.S. black teen suicide surge. And so I spent the next, if you want to freak out your friends in grad school, check out every book in the library on suicide, right? So I'm reading up, trying to understand this. And what it came down to was this. Their first theory was that it was kids in the cities because the cities were saturated with guns, and the kids who were involved in the homicides were also now committing suicide. Not the case. The kids who were killing themselves, the black kids who were killing themselves, and it's still a problem, were in the suburbs. They were the privileged kids whose parents had given them every advantage that the parents had been denied, like my mom growing up in the McCullough Homes housing projects, and yet could not give them the one thing that their parents really took for granted that was super healthy, which was when you grow up in McCullough Homes, or you're growing up on Madison, or you're over even in Ashburn, you have a tight community of people who are always checking in on you. But oftentimes when you're in the suburbs, you may not even know your neighbor. You may not even speak to them. And so it was the social isolation. Black kids' social isolation in the suburbs was through the roof, and they were killing themselves. But here's the thing. They were merely catching up with the white teen suicide rate, which we had begun to take for granted. And then I started looking at the FBI stats, and you can do this when they come out. It's the same every year. You look at, blacks, whites, different age groups, rate per 100,000 of homicide, rate per 100,000 of suicide. And it's not surprising that the rate per 100,000 for black 15 to 30-year-old men for homicide is high. And yet you look, white men over 55, handgun deaths, suicide is higher. And so I called my dad, who at the time was like 55, 56, and I was like, Dad, I started off all this research, like really worried about folks like me. I was a 24-year-old black kid in England. I said, but now, Dad, I'm more worried about guys like you. And so the number one thing that we can do to prevent suicide is in social isolation. All the old men's clubs, the Lions, the Moose, the Elks, great at preventing suicide. Best institution, except for the implications of alcoholism, best institution in Western culture for preventing suicide is the British pub. And so, if you're worried about suicide, if you're worried about the state of our men, invest in your friendships, get people out of their house. I lost an older white mentor to suicide 2 years ago. And that's just it. And if we're worried, yeah.
I'm sorry.
No. I'll stop preaching.
I was just going to say, as you and Nestor talk about that, I actually sitting here getting chills because I don't know that I reflect on that very often. Nestor, you said, Don, what's your experience? And as I sat here, I thought, I lost a dad, very successful doctor, to suicide, and I'm thinking of my wedding party many years ago, and two of my ushers I've lost. Two of the ushers in my wedding have committed suicide. So when you talk about that epidemic, it really does become very, very personal. For those of you listening, we're with Ben Jealous, a lifetime civil rights advocate, former candidate for governor in the state of Maryland, former national president of the NAACP. Ben, you don't let any grass grow under your feet. You are now the president-elect for the group called the People for the American Way. Give us a little insight as to what the group is and what you hope to accomplish.
Well, going back to Nash's comment about growing up in the land of Archie Bunker, People 4 was created by the man who created Archie Bunker. It was created by Norman Lear in 1980, along with Barbara Jordan and Dolores Huerta, and some noted business leaders, as a group to pull people together, really from the center to the left of the country, to fight what was then the rising religious right, the really kind of aggressive politicization of church leaders like Jerry Falwell, and
the Ralph Reeds, the Falwells, the Frank Grahams, that crew.
Yes, exactly. And just this idea that, like, you can pray to any God you want to pray to and believe what you want to believe, but don't turn your church into a political platform. Don't hold the Bible upside down and backwards.
And gas people and shoot rubber bullets to do it. Exactly.
Yeah, to get there. And what's beautiful about it and powerful about it is the network. So we have the Young Elected Officials Network, 1,200 young people, disproportionately female, disproportionately of color, disproportionately LGBTQ. So very inclusive. 1,200 who hold office. And my good friend Brandon Scott, who came up a little short in the mayor's race, is one of them, who hold office and have been in office since they were under 35 across the country. And we have a network of about 2,500 black pastors. We have a network of thousands of Latino voting activists. And then
I'm one of those.
Exactly. I can use your help, brother. And then we've got the kind of core group, which is a multiracial group of activists across the country. And Don, he'll appreciate this. Over half the funding is 501c4, so it gives us a lot of options for really pushing change, and virtually all of it is from individuals, a small amount from foundations on the C3 side. And so I'm excited about it, and it's and I'm at a time in my life, as a black guy with a white dad who's eager to see our country pull together, where leading an explicitly multiracial group, leading a group that extends from people who might be to a little bit to the right of me to people who are well to the left of me is exciting, because we've got to get the Democratic Party back to a place where it's a Big Tent, where people are able to disagree without being disagreeable, and who understand that we all need each other.
Well, you're a good example of that. You were a Bernie guy that fell in line and said, her emails don't matter, let's find, all of this, right? Like the fighting on our side, on the side of righteousness, right, it's particularly disconcerting at this particular point, where, as Don has said, if we can figure out how to get votes counted in November, the monster needs to be defeated. Let's
have Ben talk about that a little bit. Ben, what in the world that we can't count votes in Baltimore? I mean, I voted. Nestor and I did a segment right before you came on. Ben, I voted 2.5 weeks ago. And according to the state website, I'm not sure my vote's been counted.
No, well, that's just it, and it is a state function. And I don't think I think Larry Hogan would probably prefer that this not be a headline, that this not be a concern. But he set a certain tone in Annapolis, which when he kind of started dismantling everything that O'Malley had put in place, just to simply make that state government operated as efficiently as possible, and if there was a problem, we knew early and we could fix it, right? And Hogan came in and dismantled all that stuff as if it was some sort of inconvenience, set a tone that really this was his club, and it really didn't matter how well the agencies performed. And then, decided that Baltimore had made a pretty good whipping boy in his first campaign, and he's going to be Mr. Baltimore negative, if you will, not Mr. Baltimore positive. And
maybe if the red line got built, we wouldn't be here right now, right? So
no, I mean it's insane. That's the part that really hurts, because those of us whose families have been here for a long time. My family, moved here 80 years ago this year. Know that so goes the winner mindset was so goes Baltimore, so goes the state. The city and the state saw much better days. And now we have a governor who basically says, if Baltimore goes down, my career goes up. And it's put a lot of really good people and businesses and families in a very perilous place. We've got to make sure that ends. He won't be on the ballot again for governor. We need to make sure that the next person who leads our state really understands. So goes Baltimore. So goes Maryland.
Amen. Well, hey, Ben, you've been very gracious with your time. You got a son running around who probably wants your attention. Before you go, though.
It's with Family Robinson and the shipwreck is my house.
There's so much positive going on. You recently got involved in a philanthropic effort to actually raise $1 million during this pandemic. Fill us in a little bit on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the beautiful thing about our city. We got a call from Roxy Herbekian, who runs Unite Here Local 7. They represent all those folks who take your tickets and bring you hot dogs at the ballpark. They represent all the folks at the Marriott and the Hyatt and the Hilton, and so many other places where there are still unionized hotel and restaurant employees. And I said, Roxy, how's it going? She said, not good. I said, well, what's wrong? She said, Ben, I'm laying off my entire organizing staff. I said, what? And she said, well, I have to because 90% of my members will be laid off in the next 2 weeks. And in solidarity, we cannot be paying salaries to organizers when our members are all laid off. And she said, I said, well, how can I help? And she said, well, I need, money to, she said, folks can't afford to, 75% of Americans can't afford a $500 financial emergency. My members are no different. She said in a couple of weeks, they're going to be starving. And so I told her to call Wes Moore and the Robin Hood Foundation and some other folks. And then I hung up the call and I just thought, wait, my granddad supported my mom and my grandmother as a unionized dishwasher at the end of the Great Depression. Like, would I even exist? Would I have enjoyed every privilege our family's had since if he had lost that job? Would the bottom have simply fallen out and everything disappeared in that moment? And I also didn't know the answer. And I was so troubled, I wrote an email to every friend I have, every supporter I've ever had in the campaign. And we celebrated every check that came in, and we were moved. Some of the checks were as little as $2.50. And then suddenly, bigger and bigger and bigger checks came in as other people, the sort of, if you will, the Baltimore diaspora and the even kind of broader diaspora, people who just want to see, people in our country do well again, kind of clicked in. And all of a sudden, we had raised over $1 million. I thought maybe I would raise $25,000. And we raised over $1 million. And so we've been able to write a very large check to help those laid off hotel and restaurant employees, all the more urgent because the state's been extremely slow in getting them unemployment checks, and people are really in a very perilous place. We've been able to join Fagan Harris, who runs Baltimore Core, and Sarah, who runs Thread, and Wes, who runs Robin Hood Foundation, in supporting Food with a Focus, which is 15 parishes across Baltimore, 15 churches across Baltimore, passing out food. We fed over 3,000 families last weekend, and we'll feed probably 5,000 next weekend. We've been able to support Casa de Maryland, who's doing incredible work, including with undocumented immigrants, also a lot of them from the restaurant industry, who will not get any aid from our government. And we're getting ready to help one of the poorest schools in the city make sure that when schools open in the fall, they will be able to send laptops to all their kids, Google Chromebooks to all their kids, because that's not been possible, and they've had a lot of kids who were not able to track or to educate for months now. And we're also going to help purchase a mobile van for one of the federally funded health clinics in the city, because their concern, and I just want to hear you on this, is that you got all these kids growing up in McCullough Homes and Gilmore and Poe and et cetera, who their only health care comes at the school-based health clinics, which they expect there will be a surge in the fall, and the schools will close down again. And if the kids don't get their immunizations, you can see a diphtheria outbreak on top of the COVID outbreak.
Mm.
And so we're going to buy them a van so that they can do mobile COVID testing in these areas that are very concentrated where, people can't buy $1,000 in food from Amazon and shelter in place, but they're always, every day going out, to buy food incrementally. They'll do COVID testing there, but they'll also do immunizations as the goal. So that's what we've been focused on.
Well, Ben, I mean, so much of this goes back to leadership, right? And why you ran and why people run and who's going to lead the city and whether it's going to be Sheila, Brandon, wherever we are. But these things happen. Look, Don and I used to get into it all the time. I mean, I'm an old sports radio guy that would yell at Moeller, all the politicians are crooked, and he'd yell back at me, and we've been at this 35 years. But more than that, when you need government, and everyone has needed government the last 3 months. There's not an American, and if we've ever driven on a highway or stopped at a red light or used the internet or turned the lights on or the phone line we're on right now, all of this is governmental. And the pushback against government, the pushback against science, the pushback against education and Rhodes scholars, like smart guys like you, the pushback against all of that it's mind-numbing to me, and we have this chaos going on right now that's been seeded because we don't take care of things as well as we should, and the smartest people aren't running the school anymore.
Well, and something else has happened, which is, if you go back to the Great Depression, there was great consensus in the time of FDR that we needed to, as a nation, come together and take care of each other, right? And we made all these advances, Social Security, Works Progress Administration, all of that.
Stuff we'd never get done now politically, right? Literally.
Right, yeah, that as a nation we come together and and we take care of us. If you look at the research of a guy named John Powell, who trained a young lady named Michelle Alexander, who wrote a book called The New Jim Crow, great book. But if you look at John's research, what he'll show you is in Western democracy and after Western democracy, if you look at the images in the media of poverty in the 30s and 40s, the images were of white poor people, and the support for everything public was through the roof. By the 50s and the 60s, it had turned to black poor people or different people of color, depending on the Western democracy that you look at, Roma, etc. And public support for everything public was falling through the floor. And that's the way in which racism hurts all of us, because the reality is there's always been more poor whites than poor blacks in America. And so if you imagine the poor as black and it doesn't bother you to hurt them, you're going to end up hurting more white people than you do black people, because, there's 4 times as many whites as blacks. And even if the poverty rate among whites, say, is half that of blacks, you still got twice as many white poor people as you do black poor people. And that's the urgency in ending racism, is that it's people's inability to recognize that skin color is no more significant than hair color or eye color, that every American child, as Jack Kemp used to say, is our kid. Doesn't matter what they're our kid. That inability ultimately is undermining our ability to see us for who we are, which is each other's neighbor, and as the Bible tells us, you've got to treat your neighbor as yourself, as the Golden Rule tells us, as every major religion tells us, as every code of ethics tells us, you've got to treat your neighbor as yourself. And the day we start doing that again is the day everything gets better.
Well, Ben, thanks so much for contributing to the richness of our discussion this week. We're trying to take this serious. Look, real quick before we let you go, may people still contribute to the fund that the funds that you're raising to help all these folks in the city?
Easiest way to find it is to go to benjealous.com. It has been converted from a defunct campaign website into an active website for raising money for the Jerome and Mamie Todd Relief Fund. Jerome and Mamie Todd being my grandparents. My grandmother is a 103-year-old retired Baltimore social worker who trained an even younger social worker named Barbara Mikulski.
There you go.
She was a little feisty from what I understand.
Yes, exactly. And that's why she and my grandma got along so well.
That's how they changed the world and built the Fort McHenry Tunnel, according to Barbara Mikulski.
We're going to send everybody out you want to make a difference, you want to get involved, Just one last thought, Nestor, and I know Ben's got to run and we've got to run. But as you're talking about so many issues and race and the impact, I was struck this morning, and I would ask everybody to start having these important discussions. I noticed that my daughter posted on Facebook. I haven't talked to her yet because we've been doing interviews, but I noticed that she posted, and she said, I realized that even though we think we are, we're not having important discussions with our own children about race. And my 10-year-old grandson has been riding his bike over here every day. They live in the neighborhood not far away, and we've been doing, he and his cousin, we've been doing a small book study during the pandemic, trying to just talk about reading and go through books, and it's been fun for me and it's been fun for them. She said, I realized this morning I was trying to explain white privilege to my 10-year-old, and I could tell he didn't have a clue what I was talking about. And she said, I said, well, every day when you're getting on your bike and you grab your backpack and you've been putting a sweatshirt with a hoodie and you ride your bike through the neighborhoods over the tops, are you ever afraid? Are you ever concerned that somebody's going to attack you? Are you afraid that somebody might think you're up to it? And he said, well, of course not. And she said, well, that should help you understand because there's millions of kids in America who could say that. And those are the kinds of discussions that we need to be having around the dinner table in the United States of America.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Well, hey,
what I would say, is what they always say in the church: with great privilege comes great responsibility. It takes men to end sexism. It takes white folks to end racism. We got to have a role.
Ben, appreciate you, man. Go take care of your boy, and we will circle back. And I promise, chicken waffles, shrimp grits, food, crab cakes, crab soup, mac and cheese. It'll be something good. And ice cream, too. Good ice cream.
There we go.
All right?
All right. Thanks, guys.
Appreciate you. Ben Jealous joining us here. Took forever to find Ben. We were trying 2-3 times, and as it always happens, the longer you wait, the better the conversation gets. I'm 30 years into this. You can find me nasty at WNST.net. Former Baltimore County Executive Don Moeller is our co-host for all things Baltimore Positive. We're talking to all sorts of influential folks here on the backside of protest and race and policing and a mayoral election that we still do not have a result on, but we will. We're keeping calm. We're staying local. We are WNST.net AM 1570, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive.